All right, let's talk about Warwick, Rhode Island. The city is facing a huge decision, and if you're a taxpayer there, you are right in the thick of it. And this isn't just about building a couple of new schools. Nope. This is about a 2-decade-long story of decisions that have led to some seriously massive debt. And it all comes down to one big billion-dollar question. Who's going to foot the bill? So what's at the center of all this? This number right here, $50 million. Now, you might remember voters already gave the green light for a huge $350 million bond to build 2 new high schools. But, well, now the city's coming back and saying, oops, that's not enough. They're asking taxpayers to borrow another $50 million just to get the job done. And if you want to see just how big of a deal this is, take a look at this. We're not talking about a small jump in debt here. It's staggering. If this new bond gets a yes vote, Warwick's total debt is on track to be 10 times higher in 2027 than it was just back in 2019. Think about that. That's a huge long-term burden, and you know who pays for it, right? It's paid for it with property taxes. And that could mean some really tough choices for people, maybe even forcing seniors and families on fixed incomes out of their homes. You know, it's not just us talking about this. The big financial players are already waving red flags. S&P Global, they're one of the big credit rating agencies. They've actually downgraded Warwick's bond rating. And they pointed the finger directly at the school department's budget issues. So why should you care? Well, it's simple. A lower credit rating is like having a lower credit score. It means it's going to cost taxpayers more to borrow money for, well, for everything, including this extra $50 million. So the big question is, how on earth did Warwick end up in this spot? Well, that's what we're going to unpack. We'll look at the widening gap between students and staff, what that misalignment is actually costing everyone, the fork in the road the city is facing, who really holds the power here, and finally, what this vote is all about, what signal it sends. Okay, let's dive into the heart of the issue. This whole situation didn't just pop up overnight. Not at all. It's a problem that's been brewing for almost 20 years. It's a fundamental disconnect between how many students are actually sitting in classrooms and how many people the school district has on its payroll. I love this quote from the Cushman report because it just nails it. Warwick's fiscal crisis was not an act of God. It was a crisis of choice. It's saying this wasn't some unavoidable natural disaster. No, this was the result of a long series of choices. Or maybe more accurately, the failure to make the tough choices over and over again. So the report gives this problem a fancy name, structural decoupling. I know, it sounds a little academic, but the idea is actually super simple. Imagine you run a business, right? And you lose a huge chunk of your customers. What's one of the first things you do? You'd probably have to adjust your staffing. Well, structural decoupling is what happens when you don't do that. Student enrollment plummets, but the number of staff, it just stays the same, or believe it or not, it even goes up. And you can see how this problem got worse over time, really in 3 distinct phases. You had phase 1 from about 2007 to 2013, where things were logical. Enrollment went down, staffing went down. Makes sense. Then you get to phase 2. Adjustments were kind of inconsistent, only really happening when there was a budget crisis. But phase 3, oh boy, that's from 2020 to 2025. This is where things go completely off the rails. Staffing levels actually start to climb while student numbers are still dropping like a rock. And this table just lays it out in black and white. It's so clear. Look at phase 1 and 2. The numbers are basically moving together. Enrollment down, staffing down. But then you hit phase 3. Whoa. Enrollment drops by almost 11%, and staffing goes up by nearly 2%. That right there, according to this analysis, is the core of this entire fiscal crisis. Okay, so we see the gap. But what does that actually cost? What's the price tag on this misalignment? The report has a pretty blunt term for it: a mismanagement tax. A tax that basically every single person in work is paying. Get ready for this number. The analysis estimates that the total cost of all this excess staffing just from 2007 to 2025 comes out to $127.6 million. Let that sink in. That's how much money we're talking about, just from not matching the number of employees to the number of students. And to put that in more human terms, think about this. In that recent period, that crazy phase 3 we just talked about, the report says there were 871 cumulative excess staff positions. These aren't just numbers on a page. That's the equivalent of hundreds of jobs that, according to the data, weren't justified by the number of students. And here is the absolute kicker, the bottom line. The report argues that almost $30 million of that spending was completely avoidable just in the last 5 years. Think about that. If the school department had just aligned its staff to its enrollment, that money, tens of millions of dollars, could have gone toward building these new schools. Instead, here we are talking about borrowing another $50 million. And this problem creates all these ripple effects throughout the entire system. You've got elementary schools that are half empty, running at like 50 to 70% capacity, but millions in bond money has been spent fixing them up. It's wild. And it all leads to this. Warwick's per pupil spending is one of the highest in the state, over $3,200 higher than the average. And the argument is, are they really getting better results for all that extra cash? Okay, so that's the backstory. And it all leads us right here to today. Warwick is at a fork in the road. And this bond vote, it's being presented as a choice between two totally different paths forward. Let's look at those two paths. Path 1 is pretty straightforward. You approve the $50 million bond. The city takes on even more debt, which could lead to more credit downgrades, and almost certainly means significant property tax hikes. Then there's Path 2, which is what the report argues for. You vote no on the bond. The idea is that this would force the city's leaders to stop and make those tough internal reforms first. Things like, finally aligning staff with enrollment and finding that construction money from savings within their own budget. So that all sounds great, right? Internal reform, but who actually has the power to do it? Who can make these really tough calls? This is where understanding who's in charge becomes absolutely critical. Okay, so right now there's a state-appointed commission kind of watching over the school's money. But here's the thing. They don't have the authority to do the big stuff like reduce staffing or close those half-empty schools. And soon, that financial control is going to go back to the local school committee. Now, the report is pretty blunt about this committee. It claims they've shown zero willingness to make these kinds of cuts. It even points out how the committee leadership had to sit out recent union negotiations because of ethics rules, negotiations that ended up adding another $8.2 million in new costs. And all of this brings us to the final point, the big takeaway here. According to the analysis, this vote isn't really just about $50 million or school construction. It's about accountability. The era of kicking the can down the road has ended. Man, that really says it all, doesn't it? The argument is that for years, the tough decisions have just been postponed, pushed off for another day. But now, with debt skyrocketing and the city's credit rating taking a hit, there's no more road to kick the can down. So where does the Cushman report land? It basically concludes that the only way for taxpayers to send a crystal clear message to city and school leaders is to vote no on this bond. The message being, we're done with more borrowing until we see real fundamental changes. You need to make the spending cuts before you ask us for more debt. And so that's the question left on the table. The analysis lays out a really stark choice. Do you approve more debt and just hope that things will sort themselves out? Or do you use this vote to try and force a major shift in how the city and its schools handle their finances? Ultimately, the decision is in the hands of Warwick's voters. And whatever signal they choose to send, well, it's going to echo for a very long time.